So Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 is a pretty good game, and a lot of people like it since, as evidenced by the fact that it's the first game to win all 6 Institutional Game of the Year awards and has sold up to 10 million copies. I even like myself. There's just a lot to like. So why am I titling this video My Issues with Baldur's Gate 3? To figure that out, I wanted to put this video into context. I made a video comparing Bioware's and Larian's games to understand what they did with the RPG genre. And throughout that video I've said that the big difference between Bioware and Larian is that both of them are doing different things with the RPG genre. Bioware sees RPGs as a way to tell stories. The choices and consequences of the genre is used to enhance the story, characters, and world. Additionally, Bioware is very restrictive in what the player can do, while Larian just sees it as a way to give the player as much freedom to the same degree as seen in a tabletop game. The stories, characters, and world are secondary to giving the player freedom. What matters to them is being able to make a character and feeling like their character's behaviors and choices will be accommodated. Both styles are neither good or bad, they're just different ways of approaching an RPG. As I said in my video, they are both valid forms of an RPG. But I do have a preference, and that is for the Bioware style. The way Larian makes RPGs is just not what I want out of the genre, and what I want from my RPGs is to feel like I'm making choices that mean something, that I am playing as someone who is a part of the world, that the world feels real, and Larian just doesn't really do that for me. So I don't like a Larian style of games. What's the big deal? Well, for me, the big deal is that so many people compared Larian to Bioware, saying that Bioware has failed and Larian took up their mantle, which I don't get at all. Larian and Bioware share some similarities, but in no way was Bioware trying to do what Larian did. It's this odd thing where people are grading them and failing Bioware on a standard that they aren't trying to meet. Bioware hasn't failed to be like Larian. They weren't trying to be like them at all. I also want to give a voice for the people like me who feel like no one understands the differences between the two studios or why Larian isn't better than Bioware. Now that isn't me saying that Bioware is better than Larian, just simply saying that they're different studios trying to do different things. A better comparison would most likely be Bioware versus Spider Studios, and Spider Studios is very similar to Bioware in many ways. But this line of thinking exists, and I know when Veilguard will come out, or when Mass Effect 5 comes out, people will judge them on a standard that they aren't actually trying to meet, and not the ones they are trying to meet. So I just wanted to talk about my issues with the game, and sometimes just compare why I think Bioware was better at it. With that out of the way, let's talk about why I dislike Baldur's Gate 3. So there are a couple of things I dislike about the game. No voice protagonists, the choices aren't great, progression is bad, pacing is bad, the camping system is bad, the companions are bad in some ways, its story is odd, and its relationships to the previous Baldur's Gate games is weird. But at the heart of my issue with Baldur's Gate 3 is that I don't like RPGs where the choices I am making is simply because I want to, or because a character I have made wants to. It's cool to see how Baldur's Gate 3 accommodates so many different kinds of characters and playstyles, but to me it lacks any impact, any meaning. To get to my point across, I should explain what I mean. So when you're making a choice, you have to remember that those choices are in context of something, and that when you are making a choice, there are factors on why you made that choice. Whether those factors and context be thematic, ideological, personal, or a world one, why you choose one choice over another means something. And for Baldur's Gate 3, a lot of it boils down to the player wanted to do that. The choices are there with that context, and the only factor that is considered and supported by the game. Which is fine for what Baldur's Gate 3 is trying to do, but I just don't find it that interesting. It's very uninteresting to me. What I want out of the choices for an RPG is for the context and factors involved to be used in the mechanics of choices and consequences. I want it to be used for the storytelling of the game, whether that be a protagonist being challenged on their values or character, like in Mass Effect, or having to think about the world and the player's effect on it, like in Fallout. I want the choices and consequences to be more than just because I want to. I want the choices and consequences to be used to enhance the story, characters, themes, or world. Baldur's Gate 3 does have that to some extent with its origin characters, companions, but it's clear that isn't the norm. The player has to infer a meaning for a lot of the choices because the choices are for the player. The context is for the player, and the factor to choose either choice is from the player. Their meaning begins and ends with the player. Baldur's Gate 3's choices are used for the purpose of the player, which is why I don't like it. It's cool to see how many different characters the game supports, but I don't want that. I like stories, and stories where you can choose an outcome does so much for the story. An example of this choice is between Harrowmont or Balin. The game tells the player that either choice will give them the army to fight the Darkspawn, You want to choose in between having an army or not. This is how the game frames the choice as. Who do you want to be king, and why? Those implicit questions make choosing out the candidate difficult because it can be answered in so many ways. Why do you choose Haramont? Well, because Balin killed his way to power, and allowing his corruption to go unpunished will negatively impact Dwarven society. Why did you choose Balin? Well, because Balin wants to improve Dwarven society in real ways. Allowing the castless to enter the army will bolster their ranks and help retake the parts of the deep roads, and he wants to further establish connections with the surface so that it can benefit Orzammar, unlike Haramont, who doesn't want that. And depending on your origin, answering the question can be further complicated. If you are a dwarf noble, you know what Balin did, and if you are a dwarf commoner, you know your sister and nephew are safe and loved by Balin. But the thing is, you can still choose either choice. A dwarven noble can acknowledge what Balin did, but still have him as king. A dwarven commoner can acknowledge that their sister and nephew are safe and loved by Balin, but to still understand that Balin's power grab can hurt their society. And this is what I love so much about RPGs like that and Bioware in general. When I am making a choice, it is framed in the context of what the story needs, and I am considering so many factors. The story, characters, the protagonist, and the world. I feel immersed because I'm thinking like I actually exist in the world. I never felt like that in Baldur's Gate 3. When I made a choice to side with the tieflings, druids, or goblins, I never really considered the factors I mentioned. The only thing I was really thinking is, what do I, the player, want to do? That choice isn't to put into any context other than that. Why? Well, what does the player want to do? And the factors involved begins and ends with the player. It forgoes any opportunity to use choices and consequences as a storytelling method and just makes it simply a choice the player can do. There isn't any meaning behind it other than the meaning the player makes. An example that is already mentioned, tieflings, druids, or goblins choice, the question the game asks is, why do you, the player, want to choose or not to choose any of these groups? There are many answers to that question, but the factors that are being considered are, what does my character want to do? Which means that the answer doesn't have the same kind of meaning that Dragon Age Origins has. I don't feel immersed in the world because I am only really thinking about what my character would do. I don't feel like I exist in the world, because the game is designed to make sure the player has full control over who their character is. The game never describes who the player character is. The most it ever does is a Baldurian tag, but that can be ignored in favor of a vaguer dialogue option alongside it. This is why making a choice doesn't feel great, because the game has to be vague enough where the player character can be anyone. When I'm making a choice, I'm not making a thematic or a story choice or a choice informed about the protagonist or a choice for the world. Now, technically, Baldur's Gate 3 does do this to some extent, as I have said before. You can meet the tieflings and the goblins throughout the game, some even send letters to you in the epilogue, but I think the difference here lies in the fact that the game never puts those choices into any other context but the player. So that's the difference for me, at least. Baldur's Gate 3 does have some context and factors involved with its choices, but it's either optional or so unnoticeable. But again, that's kind of the point. Baldur's Gate 3 at its core is a game about player freedom. The player can make any choice they want and therefore make any choice they want. It's not about themes, stories of the world or anything like that. What it is about is the player, and Larian is really good at that. But that is the heart of the issue. There are still other things, major and minor, that I don't like about it, Baldur's Gate 3. So let's get to those in no particular order. I don't like silent protagonists. It ruins my immersion because the player character not being able to speak just puts me off and therefore disengages me from the story and world. The reason it disengages me is the silent protagonists, for the most part, have no motivation or personality outside what the player gives them. I don't like this because I know the game doesn't support my character's motivation or personality beyond vague dialogue that is meant to fit any character. In Bioware games, they give the protagonist so much motivation and personality that is supported by the game itself. And not only that, it gives a variety of motivations and personality for the player to choose from. Every Dragon Age Origins has a variety of motivations and personality that makes them feel like they are part of the world, which leads me to another thing that I dislike about silent protagonists, and that is a lacking anchor to the world. How am I supposed to believe that the character I am playing exists in the world when it's never shown or demonstrated? Which is again why Bioware does really well. It shows you how your character fits in the world. In Dragon Age Origins, you get to play an hour-long prologue which establishes your character and what your character and what they can be. Tav just doesn't have any motivations, personality, or backstory that is supported by the game. All of it has to be headcanoned by the player, which sucks for me because that just makes the character I am playing weaker in that role in the story and the world. You can mention that the origin characters are there for a reason, to give motivation and personality for the player who wants that. The issue there is that the game is clearly designed with a custom character first, as all the origins have the same options as them, and according to Sven, he thinks it's a good idea for the player's first playthrough to be a custom character, and he views origins as replay value. Sure, wanting to give the player who wants a curated character is good and all, but the game isn't made for them. It leans towards the custom character as its preferred way to play. The game is clear that a custom character is the intended way to play. I don't like how the game does its progression and pacing. Where I'm coming from is the stance that the game doesn't do a good job at progressing and pacing out its story. The quick summary of the story is that the player has been kidnapped by mind flayers. They implanted a tadpole into the player that will turn them into a mind flayer. Act 1 is about going around finding a cure for the tadpole. Throughout the act, the player finds references to the Absolute cult, who worships the Absolute, and that the cult is being led by 3 people. They are using tadpoles. No cure exists in Act 1. Act 2 is going to the source of the tadpoles, Moonrise Towers. Note in Act 1 you can go into Act 2 and swap between them without finishing Act 1's associated main quests. Though if you do swap about, those main quests will progress without you. Getting there requires you to go through the Underdark, safe route, or the Mountain Pass, dangerous route. Note that you can go through both routes. In Act 2, the player finds out that there is no cure for the tadpole, but they could find it or prevent their transformation by siding with the Harpers led by Chira, or the cultists led by Ketheric, or find the Dalen Aelin by themselves and end the act that way. Before killing Ketheric Thorm, the player finds out who the other leaders are. They are Gortash and Orin, and all of them are worshippers of the Dead Three. And they are using the Elder Brain to control the cult by using the Netherstones. Note that you kill Ketheric regardless of who you side with. Also, the Netherstones are just powerful artifacts that are used with the Crown of Karthus, which the Elder Brain is wearing, so that it can amplify their powers. After he dies, you move on to Act 3. The player's next objective is to kill the rest of the Absolute leaders and collect their Netherstones, so they can either take over the Elder Brain or kill it. The rest of the act is just finding the remaining leaders and kill them. After that is accomplished, the Elder Brain is free from the control and starts its own plans. It also apparently planned to control, so that it can get the crown to rebuild the Mind Flayer Empire. The player can kill or take control of it. This is the basic gist of what the story is. It's obviously not everything, I know that, but this is the everything that is relevant to the main story. So let's go through why Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have great progression and pacing. The big issue I have is that the progression and pacing isn't tied to the story. It's tied to how the player wants to proceed. But that doesn't mean the game gives you a story where the player can go at their own pace and progression without the story getting in the way. The story of Baldur's Gate 3 treats itself very non-linear, even though it's a story that is linear. The story that it has is linear. The player character has been infected with a tadpole. Any person who is role-playing seriously will not do side content nor long rest, we'll get to that later, and the game continues to this. There is no point in the story where the player is justified to do something else. After Act 1 is finished, Act 2 starts off better in this regard. The player can take their time, because it does justify why the tadpole won't kill them, but where it falters is how the world doesn't really progress. You can take as many long rests as you want, and the game will not change, even though the game says the enemy is progressing. It's this disconnect from what the game says and what it does. It ruins progression and pacing, but also immersion. This also applies to Act 1. In my game, I long rested 18 times before attacking the goblin camp. In all those 18 days, the goblins made no progress in finding the Druid's Grove whatsoever, and bear in mind that the events in Act 2 are happening at the same time as Act 1, meaning that Balthazar has made no progress in getting the Night Song, nor has Ketheric seen fit to send some guys to him. I long rest 8 times in Act 2 before going to the Gauntlet and had made no progress, nor has Ketheric sent some guys. Additionally, Catherick sends guys to the Harpers to get his daughter. When they don't report back, I imagine he would send more guys or just, do something about it. Like, did Marcus not tell him the location of the Harpers? Act 3 doesn't get better at this because it wants to show how big and threatening the Elder Brain is, as it causes the act to be even more urgent. Any person taking role-playing seriously is avoiding any side quests and just beelining it to the end of the game. Allowing the player to dictate the progression and pacing of the game comes in conflict with how the story wants to be naturally progressed and paced. Again, Baldur's Gate 3 treats its story as non-linear, but it doesn't understand that the story it is telling is linear. An example of a game that allows the player to control the pacing and progression that doesn't conflict with how the story wants to be naturally progressed and paced is Fallout New Vegas. Sure, you get shot by Benny, but he thinks you're dead. There's no reason to rush because he thinks you're dead, and the wider conflict won't move until you move, because the three factions can't commit to taking over the Mojave, because if one does, they'll be destroyed by the other two. To go back to what I said about the camp system, now you can say that the long rests being like they are is a gameplay concession and that the actual time passing in lore is different. While that is true, I don't like how the camp system wasn't folded into the storytelling more and how they didn't make an effort to make it more immersive. Like, I don't get why Larian didn't even try to create the illusion of time passing, especially since the camp is an integral part to progressing companions' dialogue and story. Which brings me to the next issue I have, and that is how the camping system forces you to long rest to progress companions. For me to get all the events for my companions and other events, I had to long rest 18 times in Act 1. It's one thing if the camp is just a gameplay, but it's another when you have to long rest to progress your companions. It sucks because it ruins my immersion for the game and makes me take the story less seriously. Yeah, sure, the game says we aren't going to die, but man, the laissez-faire attitude is off-putting to the tension of the story. To be clear, I don't mind that some characters would act like that. What I mind is the game allowing the player to choose when to long rest, because it means the game can't pace out its story and companions' interactions well. It's not crafted with the idea of showing the player something when the time is right. The story is so urgent that the player will never stop until the end, which means my favorite parts of the game is made worse. I want to talk to my companions, but the story threats are constantly looming over the player. I feel like the camping system would have been better if the player could only long rest when the game's story needed it. It can be paced out the story better and make the companion interactions a lot better. Speaking of companion interaction and other related things, I have a few issues with them. For example, when you long rest, the game will select a random event to play. In Act 1, one of these events is Astarion's bite scene, where Astarion tries to bite the player. The player notices this and then causes a commotion. I think the scene is alright. It shows off that Astarion wants to see what it's like being a vampire now that Cazador isn't controlling who he feeds on, and it demonstrates that Astarion cares about what he wants to do other than the player's consent or other people's consent. What I don't like about it is that literally no other companion comes to investigate it. It feels weird to finish that event and then everyone gives an opinion afterwards. Like, you were literally there, all five of you. It would have been so cool to see all the companions' immediate reactions to the event and what they would have wanted to happen. It would make the companions you recruit feel like they're all in on this and aren't just a bunch of guys in the same place. Baldur's Gate 3's companions and companion interaction is lacking, and there isn't that great. Like, Gale cooks for you, but the player doesn't know that until they hear a banter line about it. Wouldn't it have been great if the first time you make a camp with Gale, he offers to cook, saying something along the lines that he was taught how to cook by his mom, and his mom is the best cook he's ever known, and other stuff like that would make your companions getting together and just chatting would be really great. Where they were speaking about what they were doing before they got kidnapped, which the game never really answers that, and they just talk. I would have liked that a lot. Because as it stands now, Baldur's Gate 3 just doesn't have the companions interacting with each other beyond banter and a couple of lines on a companion quest. Not to the companion, but just to you and not to them. And this wasn't improved in patch 5 where they added the new epilogues. It was a great epilogue for wrapping up and giving closure to the companions, but it doesn't address the fact that the companions literally don't interact with each other. They stand around saying the same lines over and over again, never going to another companion and having a full-on conversation. Like with Mass Effect 3's Citadel DLC, it did it really well. All the companions were in their own groups just talking, and when Shepard came to interact with them, you could see that they would be talking with you and with the other companions as well. It made them feel like people. But in the epilogue on Baldur's Gate 3, it just doesn't do that. It didn't have the night progressing like how it did in Mass Effect 3 either. And not only that, but Baldur's Gate 3's new epilogue is only really good in giving the characters closure and not for the world. We get some snippets about how the world is doing, but no full-on cutscene or dialogue explaining what happened to them in the future. It just isn't that great. Like, it would have been nice to have something similar to Dragon Age Origins epilogues, where we get a snippet into the future in a narrated way or just a slideshow way. It just kind of sucks. And this isn't made any better because it feels like the companions don't have a lot going on beyond romances. It feels like you don't do anything with them outside of that. Like, what does a friendship with any of the companions look like? Not much. You don't really do anything. Also, romances in Larian games feel weird. In Bioware games, you have to commit to the romance you're pursuing. Eventually, you get locked into a romance. You can back out of it, but that means you can't switch romantic partners that easily. Yet in Baldur's Gate 3, it feels like the romances are designed in such a way where you could end the romance you started in Act 1 during Act 3, and then you can catch up on another romance with another character. It just feels like the romances just starts and stop. And yeah, that's just because a lot of the characters are only built for their romances. A friendship with Astarion doesn't have you having any similar scenes with a romance Astarion, and that's obviously obvious because, well, that's a romance context, but there's no friendship, there's no going out, there's no talking to him in a secluded place or whatever. It just doesn't feel like you form a connection with them. And then we get to the comments companions have on other companions' quests. It's just to the bare minimum, and the banter isn't great. A lot of it boils down to sees object, comments on object, and speak on how that object reminds them of something. Other companion says cool or nah, and then maybe says their thoughts on object. Or they are making jokes. There isn't just a banter that goes beyond that and really delves into characters. Bioware is the peak of companion banter. No other game's banter has stuck with me as much. In Dragon Age Inquisition, Varric and Solus have this banter, and it's just wonderful.
Is there at least a movement to reunite Orzammar and Kal Sharok?
What is it with you, Chuckles? Why do you care so much about the dwarves?
Once, in the Fade, I saw the memory of a man who lived alone on an island. Most of his tribe had fallen to beasts or disease. His wife had died in childbirth. He was the only one left. He could have struck out on his own, to find a new land, new people. But he stayed. He spent every day catching fish in a little boat. Every night drinking fermented fruit juice and watching the stars.
I can think of worse lives.
How can you be happy surrendering? Knowing it'll all end with you? How can you not fight?
I suppose it depends on the quality of the fermented fruit juice.
So it seems. You truly are content to sit in the sun, never wondering what you could have been, never fighting back.
Ha, you've got it all wrong, Chuckles. This is fighting back.
How does passively accepting your fate constitute a fight?
In that story of yours, the fisherman watching the stars dying alone, you thought he gave up, right?
Yes.
But he went on living. He lost everyone, but he still got up every morning. He made a life, even if it was alone. That's the world. Everything you build, it tears down. Everything you've got, it takes. And it's gone forever. The only choices you get are to lie down and die or keep going. He kept going. That's as close to beating the world as anyone gets.
Well said. Perhaps I was mistaken.
I love how it not only describes the relationship between the two, but also on how it shows their own ideology. You understand that Solus is trying to gauge what Varric thinks about losing everything and choose to be alone. Varric thinks that while it isn't great, you can continue on. The man living alone didn't give up. He chose to keep going even if he is alone. This mirrors what Solus feels about the elves and the world, and at the same time shows what Varric thinks. It's just so good. And the Baldur's Gate 3 companions just don't reach that. Additionally, there is just a lack of meaningful interactions with the player character. Like at the end of the game, when you go off to face the Elder Brain, there's no final chat. There isn't a summation of your adventures with your companions, no last night like in any Bioware games. You can talk to them, but their dialogue is minimal. I don't get it. What's even worse, as I said before, is that they could have addressed that in the epilogue. Instead, you have all the companions just sitting in their own corners repeating the same lines over and over again. The epilogue could have been Baldur's Gate 3's own Citadel DLC, where you have everyone just talking to each other about their own thing, and it could have felt like the night progressed, changing who you talk to. It just has a lot of potential, and I don't know, to go off script just a bit, and this is going to be very rambly, and that's like, it feels like they could have had something like Ascended Astarion and God Gale like banting about each other. Ascended Astarion says something along the lines of, "While it seems like you've attained far greater power than I, it seems like you can't really affect the mortal world anymore. Strike me down, I dare you. You can't do that. Ayo would get uppity with you." Or something like that. Like, this back and forth, this acknowledgement of each characters, but like, they're islands in themselves. They don't do that. And like, I read my script here, someone says mention Bacchus somewhere, and I don't know. I think one of the reasons why I did this is Bacchus to me feels like a very memorable character because we get to know him a bit, you know? Like, what is Bacchus trying to do? Bacchus is trying to find his friend. Why is he trying to find his friend? Because he's a close childhood friend and he's concerned that he's getting into a group that's too rough. And as we progress, we learn a lot about him. Not as much as the other companions, but like, it feels meaningful, you know? Okay, so another issue I have is that you can barely ask companions questions. What I mean by this isn't the fact that you can't ask any questions, just that the questions offered aren't enough. This is a problem with Baldur's Gate 3 broadly, but let's just look at the companions. So for example, you can't ask Gale about his parents. You simply can't. The only time he'll mention his parents is in Act 1, in a missable side quest where the dialogue is missable if you don't bring him. The side quest I am referring to is Save the Tiefling Child Mirkon. Only in the Act 3 do we get to know his mom's name, and not his dad's. And after finding this out, you can't really talk to him about it. Why am I making this such an issue is because knowing Gale's mom makes his struggle more interesting. Imagine the dream event in Act 2 having Gale to deal with the fact that he pushed his mother away because he was ashamed at what he did. And now he might not get a chance to visit her again or say sorry. But this is just me making stuff up. We honestly don't know what Gale's relationship to his mom is beyond Tara saying she misses him. But what does Gale think? We can only assume. Not allowing the player to ask questions makes the companions feel lacking, which what ties them into this world, what motivates them. What if Gale was poor as a kid? As a result, he grew up ambitious, wanting more for his family. So when he developed his magic, his ambition grew. He now makes sure to take care of his family. What if this is why Gale is so ambitious? But we don't know. The game answers this because that's what wizards do. Like, that's not an answer, it's a funny meme, but if that is what motivates Gale, then it should be elaborated on. Not some assumption the player makes on what motivates Gale. This is just such a missed opportunity to enhance Gale's story by using his backstory, by using his parents. Another example is Karlach. Again, why can't we ask about Karlach's parents? Oh, you only get to know about them at the end of the game in a very missable spot. Like, I think knowing about Karlach's parents early on would do a lot to enhance the story, because when she does talk about them, the writing of those scenes are really good. She talks about how if they were still around, she wouldn't have had her heart removed. She would have had a better life. It enhances the emotions the writers are going for. She has lost so much of her life, and now that she has control again, she's going to die before she gets it started. But it could have been done better. What if the player, with an appropriate approval level, asks her about her parents? She tells a similar story to the one in Act 3, but at the end she asks the player if she can visit the grave. It would have made going to the city a lot more impactful and something to look forward to. Additionally, I think it would have been great if each act has her reveal more about them. It would have put into perspective of what she lost and how tragic it is that she can't make up for lost time. It would make the Gortash scene even better, because it just has a lot more build up to it. This applies to most of the companions. You can't get a good idea of what their lives are like, making their stories not as great and making them less believable as characters. In contrast, Dragon Age allows the player to ask more questions on the companions. It makes their stories better and them as characters better. Cassandra stands in contrast to her family, as instead of being a noble who took after her brother, being a warrior who is fighting for something. It explains so much about her character and what motivates her. There's so much the game could do if we were allowed to ask companions questions, because as I said before, it can make their stories a lot better, and also make them feel more real, like they actually exist in the world. I just feel like there were so many missed opportunities with the companions. They have a lot of great moments, but they are held back from being great. Baldur's Gate 3's story is weird. I tried to approach it from a lot of different angles, but the core issue is that the story doesn't know what it's trying to say or be about. What is Baldur's Gate 3's story trying to say? I don't know. Baldur's Gate 3's story feels like isn't really trying to say anything. The closest you can say is that the story is about abuse, but that doesn't reflect in its main quest. It's truer for the companions than the main quest. Baldur's Gate 3 certainly is about abuse, but it isn't what the story is trying to say, for a few reasons. For one, you can just ignore companions. All the themes of abuse just go away. You can still engage in the companions' quest without them, but it lacks context. You don't understand that all of these things you're seeing, all these images, dialogue and whatnot, are referencing abuse. You don't have the companions to be a stand-in for them. For two, the main quest doesn't focus on or bring attention to any abuse. The player has to make the connection for the game. What I think the story is trying to discuss is about how gods interfere in mortal lives for good or bad. The main antagonists are all the worshippers of the Dead Three, Bane, Baal, and Merkel, who have conspired to wreak havoc on the mortal world. Shar, who cursed the Ruithwin and the lands surrounding it to be shrouded in shadows, which kills anyone who passes through it. Seluna's daughter, Daemon Aela, can help the player defeat Ketheric Thorm. Vlaakith imprisoned Orpheus because he saw her sacrifice his mother, the savior of the Gith, to make a pact with the dragons. This triggered a war which Vlaakith won. Vlaakith imprisoned Orpheus because he could resist the Mind Flayer's power, and she is stealing souls of the Githyanki to make herself a true god. Withers is the former god of Jergal, who essentially gave the Dead Three their godhood. This is all in the main quest of the game. But there is an issue. The game doesn't really explore the questions like, why do the gods interfere, why are they allowed to interfere, why can't other gods stop them from interfering, and general lore questions like, why are the Dead Three called the Dead Three, and no, answering it in a loading screen isn't enough, why isn't Seluna's side to the story, and shouldn't Shar take issues with other like gods like Lythander and Almantur, why doesn't that come up? What? Withers is a god, and not only that was a god who gave the Dead Three their godhood? Why can't we ask him questions about that? Like, does he regret it? There are answers to all these questions, but none of them appear in the game. Another issue that the game doesn't make, they don't make a connection that the Absolute is just using the followers in the same way as previous gods did, with no care for them at all. The goblins did worship Maglubliet, who in-game stated to not have been a great god to the goblins. So, when they are introduced... Actually, how did the goblins start worshipping the Absolute? I went and looked this up and I found literally nothing. Like, nothing. I guess the implication is that some of the goblin leaders were made into true souls, tadpoled, and then switched from Maglubliet to the Absolute. The basic point I'm trying to make is that when they were converted to the Absolute worship, they traded one bad god for another, because as we see throughout the game, the whole game, the goblins are just cannon fodder. They are as useful as they are soaking up hits for their masters, but you can never really point this out in the game to the goblins, that they have been tricked into dying for someone else's gain. I think it would have been a really great moment to allow the player to convince the goblins to stop helping the Absolute, and a way to do that is either help Brackle to convert them back to Maglubliet, or have them stop worshipping any god. It would have been both a great option for the player to have and a way to relay the themes of the games. You actually are prompted to think about how the gods are affecting the goblins and how you want to engage with it. Do you not care? Should they worship a god even if it's still a bad one, or should they worship no one at all? But the game doesn't do that. You can kill them or not. It's things like this that makes the themes in Baldur's Gate 3 weak. The game never really explores them through gameplay, or it doesn't answer any of the questions above. It makes the whole thing feel like an afterthought, and that is an issue for me. It makes engaging in the story feel terrible, because it doesn't seem to be willing to do anything with it. The only way this story really works is if the player puts in the effort to make it work, but this is doing the job for Larian. Baldur's Gate 3 isn't Dark Souls, where the point is the player making connections with scattered pieces of lore and cryptic dialogue. Baldur's Gate 3 isn't trying to do that. This is why discussing the story of Baldur's Gate 3 is hard, because the game doesn't seem to know what it wants to say. There's a lot it does say, but none of it feels like it is focused on the game, which leads to the experience feeling very disjointed. The only real way to enjoy Baldur's Gate 3 is thinking of it like a DM story. The DM has some plans for the story, but the players aren't really paying attention and mostly just doing their own thing. What the DM has to do is to make sure the story is functional enough for where the players won't question it. The story is more of a backdrop for their adventure. There are other issues like plot construction, and not enough thought was put into examining the long-term consequences of certain plot elements. To explain, how did Ketheric Thorm gain his immortality when the Nightson was in the Shadowfell the entire time? At the time of the game, he died 100 years ago, so he wasn't immortal, because he died. But when he was revived to be Merkel's chosen, he then somehow gained immortality a bit after that. How did that exactly happen? The Nightson was in the Shadowfell. Ketheric Thorm, the Sharan, could have entered in, but Ketheric Thorm, the chosen of Merkel, couldn't, because Shar doesn't like traitors. So he would die immediately. So how did he gain immortality when the person he needed it from was inaccessible to him? No idea. The game never explains how this happens, it's just a thing, and that kind of sucks. Like, it makes him as a threat and less of a person real, because it hinges on the player not asking questions. Additionally, when he puts the soul cage on the Nightson, why didn't he move them? The whole reason Ketheric bothered to go back was to move them, but like, he was there before, he had to be, so why didn't he move them? And why does he want them to be moved? It's not like anyone can just go into the Shadowfell. And why didn't Shar just kill her? Was it because Shar was going to kill her with Shadowheart? But if Shadowheart dies, why didn't she just then kill her? It's not like she seems bothered by the fact that the current Justiciars aren't killing the Nightson. The more you think about it, the harder it is to take seriously. Ketheric Thorm is presented as a very good villain. He has great dialogue and an amazing voice actor, but the bones and backstory of his story for him feels dumb. It makes it hard to take him as this great general because his plan seems dumb. He for some reason went to the Shadowfell, and by him I mean sending Balthazar to cage the Nightson and then didn't take them back. Also, how didn't Shaw kill him or Balthazar for doing this? Like what, Merkel's gonna be a real threat to her? It's literally her realm, and it hinges on the fact that Shar isn't petty enough to kill the Nightson. Also, if there was a reason why she can't do that, then it needs to be explained. So there are a lot of issues with the Astral Prism, but let's just explain what the Astral Prism does. Your character gets infected by a tadpole, and in the story, the people infected with the tadpole will be controlled by the Absolute. Under this control, they are referred to as True Souls. The only reason your character isn't controlled is because of the Astral Prism. The reason it can protect you from the effects of the tadpole is because it is trapping the lost Githyanki prince Orpheus, who has the ability to give others and himself protection from the mind flayers and tadpoles. And to mention quickly, a mind flayer called the Emperor is also inside the Astral Prism controlling Orpheus's abilities. This makes sense for why your character isn't being controlled, but there is an issue for this. For one, how does the protection work? It's clear the protection has to be extended as shown in Act 3. The only reason you get Minsk as a companion, who is tadpoled, is because the Emperor extends the Astral Prism's protection. It's not a passive aura effect, except when it is for Manthara, it is a passive aura, which is weird. Like, which is it? Does the protection has to be extended, or is it a passive aura, or is it both? Regardless, the game is inconsistent about this. If it is both, then any true soul encountered should feel the effects of the Astral Prism, but they don't. Throughout the whole game, no one reacts to not hearing the Absolute's voice. It's just odd that the mechanics of this extremely important artifact isn't thought out. Now, I don't think the game needs to explain how it works, but it should be consistent with its effects so the player can work it out. Other questions like, how far does the protection extend? When your companions leave for whatever reason, or you don't recruit them, shouldn't they become true souls? In the game, we see the moment someone is tadpoled, they get controlled by the Absolute near immediately. Now, granted, the reason the player and the companions weren't controlled right from the start is because the Absolute used them to disrupt the Dead 3. I get that, but still, why aren't the companions controlled before you meet them or after they leave you? But this just isn't the case. The logic of how the Astral Prism work is just broken. Additionally, another issue with the Astral Prism is that the player can't use it to extend its protection to other true souls. Now, you can say the Emperor would have refused to do that and only did it with Minsk because his hand was forced, but that ignores the fact that the player should have had the option to ask the Emperor to extend the Prism's protection to the other true souls. Even if they refuse it should still be something the player can attempt to do. The point is that it's clear that the Astral Prism can extend its protection to other true souls. Both Minthara and Minsk show this. What this means is that the Astral Prism isn't being used as a scribe. Wouldn't it make sense for the player to use it to free every true soul they encounter? It would cripple the Absolute, and it would give the player a force that would be willing to fight the Absolute. Being mind controlled and then freed is a very powerful motivator. Minthara is a true soul and a companion. Her story is about giving people a chance, even if they don't deserve it. It's clear when you romance her that while she isn't a great person, she is someone who is hurt, which is great and all, but the issue still comes from the fact that the player can't just use the Astral Prism to save her, and this is where the mechanic of the Astral Prism being consistent comes into play. Minthara and Minsk don't share the fact that the Emperor extended its protection to them. Minthara is just protected when you rescue her from Moonrise Towers. It's weird, but the point is that the player can't even attempt to protect her in the Goblin Camp. Why? I point this out as Minthara can only be recruited if you kill all the Tieflings and Druids, in the release version at least, which makes her story lacking. Like, her saying she is happy you gave her a chance is a cool scene, but it's weird because to give her a chance you have to kill so many people. Minthara acting the way she is shown is undermined by the way you acquire her. It would have been better if they simply used the Astral Prism. Instead they patched it where you could just get Minthara by either killing the Tieflings and Druids or just knocking her out, which is weird for so many reasons. For one, it's clear you failed your mission. Halsin wanted them dead, and him being okay with it, with you just knocking them out while he's literally there, is just dumb. Additionally, it doesn't make sense for the player to just knock her out. Why only knock her out and not the others? What indication is shown that she should be spared and not the others? It's an imperfect solution to have a different way to recruit her. They did that instead of just having to use the Astral Prism. The obvious reason is because she was planned to be recruited if you murdered the Tieflings and Druids. If you recruit her in Act 1, it would be clear that she has no content whatsoever. The point I'm trying to make is that the Astral Prism is described as protecting a person from the influence of the tadpole, but it can't be used to protect others even though it can. It's an arbitrary limitation and throws the story out, because if it can do that as it is described, it would change so much. Act 1 would be the player just freeing the true souls and having them on your side. The conflict would end without fighting or much fighting. Nier would likewise join the player, especially considering the fact that he's a male drow, and male drow are basically enslaved, which means he would hate the fact that he went from being enslaved by female drow to the Absolute. In Act 2, Marcus would not attack Isabel and help against the Absolute. Every true soul in Moonrise Towers would turn against the Absolute. Same with Act 3. But since the Astral Prism doesn't do that, it feels more like a plot device than an actual object in the game. It can only protect who the writers say it can protect. There are many other issues with Baldur's Gate 3's plot, but these are the two fairly bad ones. Another one I know involves Orin and Gortash, so both of them want for the player to kill the other one. Cool. Issue, why can't they do that themselves? Orin says Gortash made her swear an oath so that she can't kill Gortash. Cool, I have no problems with that. Would be cool to see how Gortash did that, or if Gortash asks us to swear a similar oath, but that's fine. The issue is, why can't Gortash kill Orin? Like, yeah, Orin is tough, but he has an army of Steel Watchers. He can't spare like 20 of them to just go and kill her, and it's not like he doesn't know where she is. Like, he knows where the Elder Brain is, and they are literally next to the Temple of Baal. What? The door is in the way? A bunch of Steel Watchers can't break it? Or the number of explosives Gortash has? I just don't generally believe Gortash needs the player to kill Orin. He didn't make the oath to her, she made the oath to him, so that doesn't apply. You can say that's because Gortash needs another person to help bind the Elder Brain, but even then he is prepared to do it alone or can just help the player. Baldur's Gate 3's key plot elements are supposed to hold the game together, but when examined, it's clear that they are only functional on the surface. Now for my final point, Baldur's Gate 3 is a sequel to Baldur's Gate 1, but as a sequel it is lacking. For one, it is not in line with what the previous games did. You can only play as Gorian's ward, so no origin characters, who is a fairly set protagonist with the relationship to other characters. The intended way to play the game is with a custom character who is a blank slate, so there's a big difference. Another point is that the game doesn't progress the same. Early Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 tried to make sure the player can do side quests without leaving the world to die. For Baldur's Gate 1's main quest, it was very low stakes at the beginning, while Baldur's Gate 2 gives a 20,000 gold goal to work towards. Both of those give the player a lot of leeway to do what they want, while Baldur's Gate 3 saddles the player with a metaphorical bomb in their heads. Doing any side content feels bad, because it makes the situations less real. No real person in that situation would do random stuff. And then there's other smaller stuff like gameplay things. One is real-time combat with pause, and one is a turn-based combat. And then we get to how the legacy characters are done. Jaheira and Minsk are fine. They feel like how they were in the prior games, but the issue with them and other legacy characters is the fact that their mere existence in Baldur's Gate 3 invalidates player choice. Did you know you could kill or get rid of all your companions in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2? Because you can. Additionally, all the endings of the companions could lead them down to wildly different paths. Having them there at all invalidates choices players made in the prior games, and I find that an issue. If you aren't going to account for the player's choices regarding the companions, then don't involve them. Now, you can say that Wizards of the Coast canonized choices in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. That is true, but bear in mind, Jaheira died in Wizards' canon book called The Throne of Baal, I know, yet she is alive in the game. So it's clear that Larian had some freedom in what to do. They could have respected the player's choices, but they didn't. But let's get to the two egregious examples of how Baldur's Gate 3 failed the prior game's companions. Servok, as shown in Baldur's Gate 3, is a worshipper of Baal, and yeah, that's him in Baldur's Gate 3, but that wasn't him in the prior games. Servok wasn't a worshipper of Baal. What he was someone who wanted to take the mantle of Baal and become the new god of murder. He wasn't the guy who wanted Baal's return. He was also a very smart person. He knew for him to get his goal, murdering his way won't cut it. He would have to cause a war between the city of Baldur's Gate and Alm. This war would cause so much death that he could use it to ascend and take the position of the god of murder. And he did this by orchestrating the iron shortage by manipulating the mercantile group called the Iron Throne. He was a very smart person who knew how to get his way. Yet in Baldur's Gate 3 he is none of that. All he is just a Baal worshipper. And while in Baldur's Gate 3 he was in some ways a Baal worshipper, it was an ends to a means. He would worship only so far as it would help him. Then in the Throne of Baal, you meet him again. He is reincarnated, but he is no longer a Baal spawn, and now immortal. You can recruit him as well, and if you do that, you can get a lot more insight within him. And depending on how you deal with him, his alignment can change. And that path shows that Servok did what he did for power, not for anything else but himself. Then we have Viconia. Viconia is hard to talk about because at the surface level both Viconias are similar. They embody the mannerisms and speech of a drow, and they both are Shar worshippers. At a glance it seems they are both the same. But therein lies the difference. Viconia in Baldur's Gate 3 simply isn't Viconia in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. While BG1 and B2 Viconia was bishy and evil, that wasn't her whole character. When you learn more about her, you find out that she was a Loth worshipper, but she abandoned her faith when her brother Valas was turned into a Drider because he tried to save her from being killed by their mother. And that happened when she refused to sacrifice a child. Now, it is important to remember that this doesn't mean Viconia is good. In Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, their alignment is neutral evil. They will do only good when it benefits them, but it is clear that Viconia won't serve a goddess that doesn't benefit her. The reason she is a worshipper of Shar is because of the grief and loss she has experienced. Indeed, in her epilogue, she basically didn't care that Shar admonished her for killing everyone in the Sharan cloister she was in. Baldur's Gate 3 would retcon that ending to mean that Shar asked her to do that, but that is just not what happened. Viconia isn't likely to do what she did in Baldur's Gate 3 because Shar asked her to do it. She only worships Shar because it benefits her, not because she really believes in them. And this is considering a neutral evil Viconia. If you romance her, you can change her alignment from neutral evil to true neutral. This doesn't mean that she is a sweetheart all of a sudden, but it does indicate her morality has shifted, which brings us to Viconia in Baldur's Gate 3. In Baldur's Gate 3, she is simply a lapdog for Shar. Shar tells her what to do, and she does that thing, even kidnapping a child. The previous Viconia wouldn't do that because A, it doesn't benefit her, and B, is too similar to what happened with Loth. She wouldn't do that. But Baldur's Gate 3 Viconia is all about that. I'm not saying Viconia in Baldur's Gate 3 would be a good guy, but they wouldn't be playing the same role as they are in Baldur's Gate 3. The Viconia we see is only Viconia in name. It would have been better if Larian just made up a new character and not reuse an old character inappropriately. These issues with these characters' inclusions aren't just the fact that it invalidates players' choice, it is that it fails to understand the characterizations of either character. They're simply not the same, Servok and Viconia and Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. They are different characters with the same name, and it's terrible to see these great characters just be treated like this. And yeah, these are my issues with Baldur's Gate 3. I do have a couple of more, but this video is very long and I don't necessarily think I want to get into it. Another one I would have mentioned was world building, that I think world building in Baldur's Gate 3 isn't really done that well, and that's mostly related to the fact that you can't ask questions of the, characters in the game. Now, after hearing this, you can say, why did you play the game if this wasn't for you? Well, it's because, in some ways, this was made for me. Larian made a game with great cinematics, wonderful, interesting characters, and a beautiful world. The music is amazing, and the voice acting carries the game. Larian was trying to present as a Bioware game, and I like Bioware games, but it's clearly not that. Larian's strength lies in their reactivity, gameplay, and systems. Larian is at their best with those elements, and it's what I think will be remembered about Baldur's Gate 3, a game that really supports player freedom and player agency. The game succeeds in allowing the player to make many different kinds of characters, but their stories and characters aren't adapted to that. What they are doing with them would be better suited with less player freedom and agency. Larian is at their best with what they're doing, but it is clear that the issues with them are some of their design decisions, and it comes into conflict with their broader goals at making a game that excels at player freedom and agency. So yeah, I didn't expect this to be a long video, like not at all. When I first was writing this up, I thought it was going to be a lot smaller than this, but apparently it's not. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video though. I certainly enjoyed making it. Just putting down my thoughts here. Again, I could have done a lot more, but I think this is a fine enough place to stop at. If you like this video, perhaps consider liking, maybe even subscribing, and comment down below if you want to talk about like the issues with Baldur's Gate 3, or how I'm wrong about some of the issues of Baldur's Gate 3. I'd like to hear. So yeah, enjoy.